Assalamu alaikum everybody. I hope everybody's fine, doing well, everybody's safe and sound. It's pretty hot here. The heat's been beating down on us. It's been quite a number of days now. And the worst part about this kind of heat is it's not the dry summers that we're used to. I mean, in our country we normally get these, we get this really long spell of dry summers where it gets really hot and then it starts to rain and then it gets hot again and then it rains again. There's that pleasant cycle. But now for the past 3 years, I think, what's happening is that from winter, we hardly get to see spring and then we go straight down to uh, what should be monsoon. I mean, should be in the sense that actually monsoon starts between June, or should we say more like July and August. That's monsoon season. Mid-June to August, you could say. But now what happens is that it's so freaking humid, um, starting right from March, you know. So March, instead of having that pleasant spring, we hardly get to see spring now, and we just fly through to monsoon for some odd reason. I mean, I thought the Earth was repairing itself. I mean, everybody was like, yo, because of COVID, the Earth is coming back to where it should be, and the weather is changing, and everything is normalizing. And yeah, I'm not seeing that, at least not here. Well, anyway, so I thought that I might actually do a bit of a mixed language because this is originally supposed to be not just for my readers but mainly for my Pakistani Indian readers, those people who are also members of my Learn Urdu community who wish to learn Urdu and they wish to especially get clear the confusion between Urdu and Hindi, because as I was having this discussion with one of my friends who once upon a time also sort of um, you could say refinessed their Urdu with me a bit. Um, it was the fact that I don't even know why I suddenly just decided that this was something that needed to be talked about, because maybe it's because of the fact that I realized that even I, as a person, as a teacher, I have done that, been there, where when we teach non-native Urdu speakers about words in Urdu, and we usually tend to um, join the terms Urdu Hindi together. And I just realized suddenly when one of my friends did the same thing when he was comparing religion. No, sorry, not religion. He was comparing languages. Um, like, as an English teacher, he was comparing the usage of language um, and expression between Urdu and English, which was an amazing session, by the way. Um, and I noticed that, in his title, he had sort of written, Urdu oblique Hindi, which is actually very normal. We all do that. But I don't know why it suddenly struck me that no, this was um, here maybe perhaps um, we could discuss a little bit more about where we can actually join the two terms and why we need to know where to join the terms and where not to. I mean, generally, I know people tend to, um, even us, I mean, even we do it. We, as Pakistanis, as native Urdu speakers, we tend to do this as well when we talk to any non native Urdu speaker. We always give them that thing. We were like, in Urdu, Hindi, and blah, blah, blah. But I thought that because many of my students or members of the learning Urdu community, I realized it as time went by that as they got more and more serious about learning the language, they really just realized that Hindi was actually very different from Urdu in so many ways, and they did not understand what exactly was the difference between the two, and if they really were one language, and if they were one language, then why does it have two different names, and how do they, um, I mean, how exactly do we consider each language as related to the other? And in order to clarify that confusion, I decided that we really needed to discuss this a bit. Although I'll try to keep it short and sweet, as always. I think one of the best ways to explain the relationship between Hindi and Urdu is, although I have one of the first things that I do as an Urdu teacher is I explain to the non-native Urdu speakers who want to learn Urdu, is that they need to understand that Urdu is the standard language. So the original language is Urdu. Hindi stems from Urdu. Basically, if we just have a very, very, very short summary of history here, um, basically what happened was that in the subcontinent, during the Mughal era, when the Muslims ruled, because there were so many ethnic groups that were involved, and it was a sort of a mixed race, um, and especially in the army, where they had to deal with people from Turkish origins and from Persian origins and from Mongolian origins. Sorry, I've got that tongue thing going on, and from the local Indian and Aryan origins. So they decided to um, coin all these languages together, sort of merge the different words from different languages that could be most easily understood, and they made a common language called Urdu. Now, obviously, if we go further back in history, we would realize that actually Urdu was one of the native languages that was used in one of the very smaller areas of India, which is probably which influenced them when they worked on creating this new language. So you could say maybe the roots of this language comes from that area. In any case, the whole point is that Urdu, as we know it today, was developed and worked on by the then Muslim rulers in order to make it easy for the various uh, mixed ethnic groups to communicate easily with each other so that there could be one unified language for easy communication, in short. And thus, Urdu as we know it today was born. Now, the thing about the subcontinent is that because it is a huge, huge region, which was originally obviously different states that were always at war with each other and were unified by the Muslim Empire. So after unification, they still had their own languages and they still had their own cultures and everything that they could freely um, enjoy and practice. But the Muslims of the subcontinent, they were unified in their culture and in their social norms, and obviously then in language, which was originally Persian. So first, the language that the Muslims spoke was Persian. So that meant that no matter which part of India or the subcontinent you came from, if you were a Muslim, you knew Persian and you spoke it. And that was your language of communication. And that later changed to Urdu. It became even more popular during the British Raj because obviously the British realized that the Urdu language that was created by the Muslim rulers was extremely easy to understand and to speak and to learn and to adapt, that they sort of repopularized the language to the level that a time came when the Muslims of India sort of, you know, eased their way into having Urdu as their common language rather than Persian. Now, with Urdu becoming the universal Muslim language of the subcontinent, when Pakistan was made, Urdu automatically became the Pakistani national language, obviously. For Now, India, on the other hand, did not have a national language. They didn't have this idea of having one universal language. This was a purely Muslim thing right from the start. And they just suddenly realized that they were facing problems because each province or each state had its own language and they refused to recognize the other one's language, and they didn't have a common language, they didn't have a national language. Now, keeping in mind the popularity of Urdu and um, the ease of communication in this language, the Indians decided that okay, they had no choice but to also use Urdu, but obviously they couldn't call it Urdu anymore because that was officially the Pakistani language. So they decided to call it Hindi from the British term of Hindustani, which is what the British tended to call Urdu at one point. So the actual language is Urdu, and the dialect that branched out from Urdu that was most commonly used amongst the non-Muslims of India later on, but when they tried to make it their national language, that became Hindi. And why did they start calling it Hindi? Obviously, because they couldn't use the word Urdu because that was already with us. But the other reason was because Urdu, as you can see, if you ever go through its phonetics and the grammar, vocabulary, you would notice that there are certain alphabets that we have in our language that do not exist in the local Indian languages. They do not exist in Sanskrit. They do not exist in in any of the other native Indian languages. So those words basically come from Persian, Arabic, Turkish origins. So what happened was when they created, or when they sort of bastardized Urdu into Hindi, they replaced those words because they were extremely hard for them to use in their daily life. Um, they replaced those words with ordinary Sanskrit words. But at the end of the day, so many words that belonged to your classic Urdu were still much more easier to use and pronounce than your typical Sanskrit words, which is why, once again, there was a much larger quantity of the classic Urdu version that was accommodated into Hindi. So, in India today, if you try to speak, absolute pure Hindi, even the Indians do not understand it. They much rather understand your classic Urdu, because, as I said, that is the easiest form on its own. Well, anyway, in short, this is basically what Urdu is, and this is basically how Hindi was formed. And so basically, Hindi is to Urdu what colonial English would be to English, or what Canadian French would be to French, or what Mexican Spanish would be to Spanish from Spain. What I'm trying to say is that you don't go around saying, um, so here we are going to teach you how to learn English, how to talk in English, oblique American, oblique colonial English, oblique Australian. You don't say that. You just say, we're going to teach you how to speak English. So I realized that we, on the other hand, we keep on obliquing Hindi with Urdu. Oh, we're going to teach you how to speak Urdu, oblique Hindi. In all the Urdu songs, oblique Hindi songs. So, we tend to, although it started because of the very basic or obvious reason that Bollywood had become a giant, even though most of its movies and were never original. Um, Here's something that many people may not know, but till the early 90s, most of the most famous Indian movies were actually remakes of Pakistani movies. And another thing that people may not have realized is that the Indian film industry, Bollywood, has always been uh, largely um, in the hands of the Indian Muslims right from the start. They were the pioneers, they were the ones who sort of set the film industry up. So that is why all the old legends, the actors, the singers, the musicians, the script writers, they were all Muslims. And so they wrote in Urdu, and they sang in Urdu, and they composed in Urdu. And uh, so actors and actresses who were not Muslims, they had to learn Urdu. And singers till the late 90s, um, this was a standard that singers had to learn Urdu before they could become professional singers. And, you know, even Lata Mangeshkar, she had to learn Urdu. Asha Bhosle had to learn Urdu. Otherwise, they couldn't train to be singers, especially in Bollywood. And one of the first rule of entering Bollywood was that you had to learn to read and write in Urdu, and you had to learn to pronounce Urdu the way it should be pronounced. So Urdu has always been the standard. You understand? So generally, Hindi was basically learning how to write Urdu in your local Sanskrit format. Um, you could put it this way. So you had to learn Urdu with the Urdu script, and you had to understand how to read Urdu, the Urdu script, and you have to learn how to pronounce Urdu words the way they were pronounced. You had to learn the vocabulary that was used in Urdu, and you had to learn to utilize your epiglottis where phonetics was concerned, you know, because the sounds of kh and ghan and z and seen, these are, you know, Urdu sounds that do not exist in Hindi, you know. So that's why, you know, a lot of words are mispronounced in Hindi, that are actually, for example, in Urdu you would hear words like zid. In Hindi they cannot generally pronounce the Z word. They would end up saying jid, you know, but it's zid. Similarly, you know, it would be fir. In Urdu, the word is phir, ph, p. So they don't have that p sound in the native English, in the native Indian language. Uh, so when they attempt to speak Urdu, and so they end up speaking. That's why we say they end up speaking Hindi. So basically, sort of Hindi is like a dialect. So Urdu is the standard, Hindi is the dialect. You can put it this way. So just because Bollywood became so famous and they used Urdu, so many people, you know, and they called it Hindi because, you know, they had to make India very popular, and they had to make it. They did not want people understanding the fact that they were actually using Urdu, and because if that fact came upon, then people would start understanding that Urdu actually is a language that is spoken by the Pakistanis, and you know, it's Hindi is just its dialect, its variable that has just come through. And for that reason, you know, so we started using Urdu oblique Hindi everywhere, but it's actually wrong. Technically it's wrong. Technically the language is Urdu, you know. um, that that is your base, that is your set standard. So uh, you don't go around saying, oh, I'm going to learn Hindi. Actually, that is actually the wrong term. What you would say is that I need to learn Urdu, and then when you learn Urdu, then you get to understand Hindi as a local dialect. But if you just, you know, go straight to say, oh, I'm going to learn Hindi, so basically what you're saying is that I'm going to learn colonial English, or actually, to be very honest, it's more like saying I'm going to learn Pidgin English. So you don't learn Pidgin English, you learn your standard English, and you realize that Pidgin English or colonial English or American or Australian or Canadian, these are all the different dialects, but essentially the language is English. So is exactly the same rule. Essentially, the language is Urdu. So there are a lot of words and terms that are classic Urdu terms. You cannot say, for example, that this ghazal is an Urdu Hindi ghazal. Ghazals are basically always Urdu, by the way. The word ghazal itself is Urdu. So ghazal is it's a format of Urdu poetry that is sung, you know. So these are just little things that when they start learning Urdu and they start getting aware of these little facts, then they get confused that why do we? I mean, even people who are actually trying to learn get confused, and they come up to us and they say, "But okay, we understand that this is Urdu, so then why do we say this is Urdu oblique Hindi?" So we think that we're making things easy for people when we say Urdu oblique Hindi. Oh, this Urdu Hindi song, this Urdu Hindi poetry, this Urdu Hindi ghazal, this Urdu Hindi movie. We think we're making things easy for the um, for those who are trying to learn the language as a third language. But I then later realized that actually we might not be making it so much easier for them, as much as probably increasing their confusion. So I hope that this has somehow helped with that. And yes, I intentionally kept the background, um, as I've said it once or twice before. Sometimes I think it's much better when you're listening to somebody in an audio, um, that it should not be so refined so as to have no background. You should be able to hear the birds chirp and the fans whir, and you know feel the heat in the summer. Well, I mean, feel free to ask me any questions, all of you, in Learn Urdu community. As you know, I read your messages and I promptly reply. And for those of you who have asked me about looking for Urdu tutors in your local areas, first of all, it makes things easier when you actually tell me exactly where you're from, as in which country, which city, which area. Because then it makes it a bit easier for me to look for teachers in your area to help you. Otherwise, as I've repeatedly um, um, said, please do feel free to scroll all the way down this page of Learn Urdu, and you'll find in various places I've given links where you could where you can actually find videos for learning basic Urdu, phonetics, alphabets, numbers, and I've given links to online sessions for spoken Urdu. And apart from that, every now and then I share with you a bit of the basics. Um, I try to use Roman Urdu as much as I can, basically to make things easier for you. Um, but yes, since you prefer that I add those words in Urdu, as in Urdu alphabets, then yes, I will be doing that as much as I can. So, what I try to do is that I would put the word in its original Urdu form and then the Roman Urdu and the translation in English, to make things as easier as possible. Again, do not hesitate to ask me anything. I'm always there. Yeah, we had a bit of a break, maybe you could say, because of the, Ramzan just passed, and then Eid, and now we're sort of getting back to normal. But now this heat wave seems to have started. We were expecting rains, we were expecting some tea storms. We had a few, and then we were expecting some more, but they sort of got diverted somewhere while traveling along the sea towards us. So we're, you know, sitting here in this humid, weird sort of monsoonal, non-monsoonal, pre-monsoonal heat. Well, enjoy your summers, and oh, please do look up my books. They're all in English, by the way. Um, I've got two new releases coming up. In fact, one is already out. One came out this New Year's, and that's called A Novel. Life Makes a Novel, and it's a sort of a cozy mystery, oblique romance. That's how you use oblique here. And we've got a new one coming up in 4 days. Yep, 4 days, June 1st. Look out for the series bundle of the Mist series. So I've basically put together the complete series in one bundle. And right, you can actually pre-order it on Smashwords as well as on Kindle. And the paperback will be out on Kindle exactly on the 1st of June. I'll make sure that it's out in time. So yeah, and feel free to post a review of my books. I love to hear from my readers. In fact, when I was writing book two of the Mist series, I was in constant interaction with the readers of book one. So yeah, I love to hear from my readers, and when they tell me what they would like to see more of, you know, I try to give them that, and continue being such wonderful members of the community. Stay safe, beat the heat, stay indoors, binge read your favorite books, have a wholesome quality time with yourselves, with your families, and keep learning new things. That's what life's all about. Thank you for being a part of my community. Love you all. Bye.